Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some of your questions, and this week we are going to start with Martin over on the Patreon, who asks, can you comment on the evolution of parliamentary committee structures in Canada and the UK? In the UK, as best I can tell, backbenchers elect the chairs are allocated by party representation. Has Canada considered doing that, and what would it take to introduce such change? So a couple of things there. In Canada, the chairs are allocated by a specific sort of formula. So the opposition will chair certain committees by, some of them are in the standing orders and some of them have kind of evolved by tradition or by precedent. That one being, for example, the Status of Women Committee is an opposition-led committee, which has been for a while. But certain other ones like Procedure and House Affairs and the Public Accounts Committee tend to be opposition-led committees because it's much more focused on accountability than it is on scrutiny on those particular committees. So that's how those chairs have tended to be allocated in Canada. On the Senate side, they're more allocated based on kind of standings and proportions and so on. As for the election of chairs by backbenchers in the UK, it has a certain amount of merit because it's given them a certain amount of independence from government when it's not the whip who's basically stage managing who's going to be chairing committees. But that's also led to its own certain problems in the UK as well. There's been examples in the last few years of committee chairs who've taken it upon themselves to become media darlings and who will essentially start creating problems or becoming media personalities on their own right, which creates problems for Parliament as a whole because once you start feeding a chair's ego in that regard, then it starts to diminish the work of the committee in and of itself. If it's only for getting good sound bites, then you start losing the value of the work. And that's something we need to kind of be careful of. It's still an idea with merit, and we have been slowly evolving in Canada toward a bit better of an idea in terms of how chairs are chosen within committees. But yes, the government still does have a very good say. Something I would also at least point out is there is a certain amount of merit in having the government try and have some input into certain committee chairs, if only for the sake of ensuring that there are some people who have a certain amount of experience who are kind of being directed toward those positions. Because committee work is so important, it can be really difficult to have a chair who's completely inexperienced, who's a newbie MP, who doesn't necessarily understand all the procedural ins and outs, and have them relying on their clerk the whole time to basically guide them through the process. It still happens. Another instance that is also pretty recognizable was when the Liberals blocked the Conservative choice for chair for the Status of Women Committee. But that was also not only because of her personal views around abortion, but it also had to do with the fact that she was the critic for status of women within the party. And if you're the committee chair, you're supposed to be neutral. So it didn't make a lot of sense for the Conservatives to try to put her in the chair position if she's the critic. That's the other thing I would note about UK committees that are different from Canada is that they don't have their shadow ministers on committees. That's a particular issue in Canada because we just don't have enough MPs to ensure that there aren't, critics or in some cases parliamentary secretaries on committees because we just don't have enough MPs to fill all the committee slots in that regard. It does impact on the independence of committees. During the last parliament, we were sitting committees of 10 and they ensured that the parliamentary secretaries were not voting members of the committee, so it didn't make them stage managing as much as they were under the previous Conservative government, where they had basically the parliamentary secretary stage managing the entire committee and turning it into a branch blood of a minister's office, and that just kind of ruined the whole point of committees and their independence. The current parliament, because it's a minority parliament, and because there are simply not enough bodies, what they ended up doing was bumping the committee levels back up from 10 to 12 so that they've got a better distribution of MPs to reflect the hung parliament. But that also means that there aren't enough bodies to go around, so parliamentary secretaries are basically back on committees for sheer sake of numbers. It's not great. It's the trade-off that we're seeing, and this is kind of one of the trade-offs with having a parliament the size of ours, trying to do as many things as it is. Our next question comes from Ken over Twitter, who asks, is it still too early to say whether or not Trudeau seems surer on his feet now than when he had a majority? Is this a case of a minority basically concentrating the mind, or has knocking him back a bit genuinely humbled him? That's a little hard to say just yet. There is definitely a change in how he's presenting himself. He's no longer seeing the need to be the face of everything, which is probably a positive development. On the other hand, that's kind of given space for Chrystia Freeland to be the face of all the big files. So it's a question of how we'll see how that plays out. It's still a little early to say. I think there is a certain amount of, minority politics sharpening the mind a little bit, in that I think they need to be a little more careful in how they're messaging and how they're presenting things, and in looking like they are being more consultative and being more open to ideas and other approaches. I don't know that they will necessarily change too many things, but they need to at least be seen to be open to it. And I think it's going to take some time before we really start getting all those dynamics teased out. A lot of people are still kind of flexing their muscles right now because it's still fairly post-election. The Conservatives, being in a leadership contest, are going to be blunted a little bit, but at the same time, because Andrew Scheer is staying on as leader until a new one is chosen, it's a lot of the same kind of status quo in terms of the bravado and even his particular tactics around rank dishonesty on how issues are presented. So how Trudeau responds to the next leader, I think, is going to be another whole question that we'll be asking ourselves when Parliament comes back in the fall after that new leader is in place. But yeah, it's an evolving situation, and we will see how things turn out. And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.